Hello, everyone. So I hope everyone has been having a very good and productive conference so far. You know, we started yesterday. We heard very good and wonderful, insightful messages about engineering and how these different career trajectories. And today we're in this breakout session where we're tying in technology and how the impact it has on engineering. So I'll introduce Ms. Charleston Lee. Ms. Charleston Lee will serve as the moderator for this session. We'll have Dr. Melanie Van Stry that will give the demo. Dr. Brandon Pitts will give the lived experience, and Dr. Brian C. Cooper is our speaker. But first, I'll introduce Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee is a 15-year-old paying college student, and she's a rising senior. She is a mathematics major with a emphasis or concentration in computer science. And she is a very good student. I'll just have to say that about her. So hope everyone enjoy. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. And as we go throughout this breakout session, also please be mindful to keep your audio on mute unless you have a question, and so we won't have any feedback. So we'll go to Ms. Charleston Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson, and thank you all for inviting me. So today I'll be giving the topic, which we all know is the intersection of technology and engineering. In this section, we will delve into showcase the range of technology and how we understand, use, and manage it. The objectives of this session is to show students that technology and engineering are relevant to their lives, to increase students' enthusiasm for and engagement with technology and engineering subjects, and also to elucidate the application of technological knowledge and process to real-world experiences. I will now be introducing the live experience speaker.
Hold on a second, Charleston. We'll go to Dr. Cooper first.
Okay, so I'll introduce him.
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Brian C. Cooper is the founder and CEO of the Powell Cooper LLC, a company dedicated to the development of Black PhDs in STEM-based fields. Dr. Cooper earned his PhD in experimental condensed matter physics from Penn State University, after which worked in R&D for the Intel Corporation. He is committed to the goal of widening and easing the path for future Black STEM PhDs and increasing the perceived value of their contribution. Now we will have Dr. Brian C. Cooper.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, and thank you, Dr. Nelson. Good morning to everyone else. As I said, my name is Brian Cooper. Firstly, let me just take a moment to express my immense delight in having been asked to participate in this much-needed conference, and a hearty word of thanks to the organizers and sponsoring institutions for their hard work in putting all of this together. So just a quick introduction. I received my PhD in experimental condensed matter physics from Penn State University. After completing my doctoral studies, I was recruited to join the Intel Corporation at their primary R&D facility outside of Portland, Oregon, as a plasma etch engineer. And then I later transitioned to a frames design engineer for their experimental microprocessor platforms. After several years at Intel, I began to feel as though something was a little missing in my life, and I was earning good money, but money was never enough, was never the point. So it didn't keep me happy, and I didn't feel quite as fulfilled. And like I would say, money was never really much of a factor in my decision to pursue a career in science in the first place. So as I shall discuss more in depth in this talk, when recounting and contemplating the totality of my life's experiences, both in the pursuit of education and in my career, I always felt like a proverbial unicorn, something out of the ordinary, and not necessarily in a good way. As many of you listening today can probably attest, there is a serious lack of diversity in many STEM fields, and that lack of diversity in the world of science and technology can leave members of underrepresented minority groups feeling battered and bruised at times. I do not say this because the educational journey is rigorous, but more so because the day-to-day interactions can be fraught and difficult to navigate as a person of color. That isn't to say that I regret my choice, because I definitely do not. Actually, I appreciate the fact that this moment in time is but a chord on a 400-year-long temporal continuum. 100 years ago, it was nearly unheard of to meet a Black PhD of any kind, let alone one in physics. But here I stand before you today. I stand on the shoulders of brave men and women, not just Black men and women, but all of those who have fought to open all segments of our society up to all of its constituent members. In light of this realization, I decided to start my own business, Powell Cooper LLC, as a company that's devoted to the goal of increasing the numbers of African Americans and other underrepresented minority groups in STEM-based fields. It was a very tough road getting to where I am in my professional life. And now that I have some depth of knowledge and the experience needed in order to navigate this world, I decided my life's mission is to show others the way forward. I do all of this in the hopes that someday there will be no unfair hurdles placed before people of color or women in realizing their dreams. I'm excited to share the highlights of my journey and the lessons learned during it all with you, and especially with those of you at or near the beginning of your academic journey. No two people's experiences are exactly alike, obviously, right? But much of my story will sound familiar to you. It's my hope that you'll take away a message that you can achieve your goals even when the road is tough and the journey is fraught. So with that, let me begin. I guess my love affair with learning truly started way back with my maternal grandmother, Christina Loney. She was born into a family of sharecroppers in South Carolina, but left the South and headed north during the Great Migration in order to find work and a better life. See, Christina was denied a high school diploma, which had always been her greatest regret. She was denied it not because her local high school wouldn't award one to her, but rather because she was forced to stop attending school by her own family. As far as they were concerned, an education was a waste of time and resources for a Black woman in the South. It wasn't that her family believed she was incapable of earning her diploma, nor was it because of some arcane philosophy that espoused the belief that women shouldn't be educated, but rather it was because of the practicalities of the day. They needed the extra set of hands to make the ends meet. And her forebears had rarely seen a Black woman do much more than what she was already doing, which was toiling in a field or scrubbing someone's kitchen. She had an indomitable spirit, and so that did not stop her, initially at least. Some of my fondest and most cherished memories of my grandmother was when she would regale me of these stories about her disobedience in the pursuit of knowledge. She'd march dutifully into the fields to work, she would say, and only to abandon her tools and to pick up her cleverly stashed school supplies and make a beeline to the school when the time was right. And she told me that she would get beaten if she wasn't found working. So eventually, her parents, after enough trials, they found out, they got wise, and they put an end to it permanently. Her greatest dream at the time was to be a nurse. That was the highest profession that seemed possible for a Black woman in her day. But she never made it past the 11th grade. So she would have to be content with living vicariously through her own children. And she instilled in my mother, and later myself, the notion that the most important thing in the world was an education. So as you can imagine, she was quite determined to make sure that her children wouldn't be denied what she had been denied. I hope you believe me when I say, for my grandmother, the daughter of sharecroppers, a single mother of 5, and with only an 11th grade education, sending her eldest daughter, my mother, to college was no small feat. My mother, like my father, was the first to attend college in her family. My parents met while they were studying at Payne College in the 70s. Go, Miss Lee. Funny enough, my father was my mother's math tutor, because I guess math is the reason why I exist. But not too long after that, it was where my story begins. I was born in the winter following my parents' graduation from college. And after finishing undergraduate, my father went to medical school and my mother moved back into the housing project in Philadelphia with her mother and 4 sisters. I wouldn't come to realize until much later on in my life that my mother had actually forfeited her own dream of becoming a doctor in order to bring me into this world. So, left with only a biology bachelor's degree, no means to pursue a graduate degree, a newborn, and no prospects for a Black woman in the 70s to find work in her chosen field, she began to do office work. In fact, she was working 2 jobs and somehow managed to raise me and complete her RN degree. And at the very least, sorry. I'm hearing some interference in my line. Okay, sorry. we are. Oh, so I was saying she finished her RN degree in about 4 years, and she was able to start getting some work. Though my parents were both earning more money than anyone on either side of their families had before, they were hardly rolling in it. But it was enough for me to attend a small Irish Catholic school in South Philadelphia. St. Philip Neri was the name. And the school was about 60% white, 40% black, but that didn't safeguard the black students from the realities of living in a racialized America. This would be the first time that I had left the shelter of my family and the Black community to enter into an integrated space. And that's when my education about what it means to be a Black man in this world truly began. One of the most salient examples and moments in my life, and probably the most profound to date at that time of the occurrence, took place in 3rd grade. My teacher at the time wrote a word on the board, A-S-K. And then she asked the white children only to say the word. And they replied, ask. Then my teacher turned and asked the Black children to say it. And we all said, ax, uttering the word in our local South Philly Black accent, which is a mashup of Southern dialects and overarching harsh Northeastern fricatives. Afterwards, she told us, the Black students, how we spoke incorrectly and that needed to be fixed. It wasn't said in a nurturing way. In fact, it felt a bit chidingly dismissive. I felt ridiculed. So I remember the feeling of aggrievement at having been singled out this way. And though at the time I lacked the sophistication and life's experience and knowledge of a racialized historical events necessary to thoroughly understand the nature of my teacher's bias behind that particular lesson plan, because I was only 8, yet I knew I did not want to be treated differently because of that way in which I spoke. So that day, I made a conscious decision to standardize my speech so I wouldn't be made to feel less than again. But little did I know at the time, that incident was the genesis of a very destructive mode of thinking, which would build up more and more after each of these types of interactions. I had unwittingly allowed this person and many like her in the future to make me feel that I was less than because of the color of my skin. That somehow what I wasn't good enough. I began to see my color as a hefty social tax, and I was determined to do anything to escape paying it. It would be another 10 years before I had dismantled the mechanisms driving that pernicious form of internal self-loathing. Self-loathing that I found quite, unfortunately, to be ubiquitous in our culture. Why do I mention this today? Because I believe wholeheartedly that in order to win the battle against bias, implicit or explicit, and racial animus, and to truly establish a more perfect union, as exclaimed in the foundational document upon which this great nation was based, we must first acknowledge the damage that it has done to us as individuals and collectively, not just as people of color, but as citizens of the United States and moreover as human beings. I'll revisit this thread in more detail after I've provided more context to the events of my life. So my time at St. Philip's was replete with examples of discrimination and ill treatment due to the color of my skin. My mind was forced to develop a miasma of bias for 8 years, soaking in the subtle cues of my apparent inferiority. Though I was the top student in my school, I loved learning. Nay, I love learning, present tense. No matter how I may have been made to feel in that strange and sometimes unwelcoming environment, I took great comfort and solace in my books. Books, or e-readers today maybe, are your sword, your shield, and your shelter. I recall when I was learning how to add and subtract fractions in elementary school, I struggled something terribly conceptually with it. Actually, sometimes it's even a little embarrassing, I think about it, but it wasn't that the concept was difficult, but rather my issue was the manner in which the information was conveyed, and that was by rote. The teacher's one-size-fits-all approach, there was little to nothing about the governing logic behind the calculation. And see, I'm a very logical being. Some of my friends even jokingly call me a Vulcan, if you get the Star Trek reference. But as a highly analytical and logical person, if something doesn't make sense to me, it is very difficult for me to retain or use that information. So over the years, I've asked myself and asked my friends and colleagues about their experiences in their early education and found that many of the people I asked had similar stories. Maybe not the exact same difficulties I had, but rather they had teachers that defaulted to that centuries-old methodology of mechanistically drilling mathematical precepts into their students' heads, as opposed to a philosophical and analytical approach. In other words, understanding the concept at very fundamental levels. After struggling with that mightily, trying to remember those seemingly nonsensical steps, I started to conclude that I wasn't actually good at math. But then it was my mother, and she reminded me, a mathematics textbook, Brian, is just a book, which meant it's meant to be read. And I know that might seem obvious, but is it really? How many of you, for instance, listening to me, when you take a mathematics or a mathematically intensive science course, thumb through the leaves of the text for the equations or the worked out problems and merely gloss over the rest of the text? Well, I know I'm not going to receive an answer to that just now, perhaps in the Q&A. But given my years of teaching, I would guess a great many of you have adopted this approach. This isn't the best way to learn math or science. Mathematics is a language that describes our physical universe, our bodies, everything that we perceive. When I read my math textbook as I would a novel, well, maybe not quite like a novel, but close enough, that world opened up for me the day. And from that moment forward, I realized I didn't need to rely on anyone to learn. I had myself, and I had the text. The class was simply an opportunity to gain a greater insight into the subject matter, not the primary source. Take that away. It's very important. You drive your train. I think of Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educational philosopher who championed the view of creating critical thinkers in the classroom, as that should be the goal of any good teaching methodology. And also, he was strenuously rejected the old tabula rasa philosophical approach to pedagogy, which espoused the idea that children's minds were akin to an empty receptacle that needed to be filled. Facts alone, in the absence of context, have little ability to enlighten us, and they reduce the depth of our understanding unless we see how such problems can play out in the real world. So when I taught undergraduate classes while I was working at Penn State, working my doctorate at Penn State, I began to share the techniques that I had learned, developed over my own educational journey with my students, and encourage them to take an active approach to the learning process. We all know that in order to grow our muscles, we have to apply resistance in the form of weights or strengthening exercises, and so it's true for our minds. Right before graduation from St. Philip's, I received a full scholarship to one of the local Catholic high schools in the area, but my mother made me decline it as I had been accepted into Philadelphia's most prestigious magnet school. She wanted me to have access to a more diverse environment and access to a superior education in the company of very motivated students. And my high school, Deer Central High, was full of geeks, nerds, and dweebs of all shapes, sizes, creeds, colors, cultures, what have you. It was truly an academic catharsis for me. When I started, I found in my studies there, I didn't feel like a weirdo for being intelligent or wanting to learn or wanting to talk about something that I found interesting. I could speak to my classmates about the things that I read and actually be engaged by them on the subject matter without being made to feel like an oddity. I felt challenged for the first time in my life, and it was exhilarating. Even though my experiences at Central were very largely positive, the subtle signals that I would somehow, you might not be quite as good as some of your other white peers was still undeniably persistent. These subtle cues that I received and still receive to this very day are by no means unique to my experience, but they're a cumulative effect and they are substantial. It takes a toll to walk through the world in melanin fused skin. So I began to doubt my abilities and my chosen path as a result again. By the time that I left engineering, someone needs to mute. Oh, sorry, it's getting background.
1 second, Dr. Cooper. Can everyone please mute their audio, please?
Oh, guy. Who's Cooper 17?
Miss Courtney, can you please mute?
Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Cooper.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was just getting a little reverb. So, by the time I entered NYU for my undergraduate, I had lost a lot of self-esteem, confidence, and focus that I didn't feel like myself anymore. Also, financial issues began to seep in, which I'm sure many of you are familiar. And I found myself stressing out more from the calls from the bursar's office instead of my coursework. So naturally, my grades began to fall. I knew that I needed time to get my head straight, and with no ability to pay for the remainder of the term, I was forced to drop out of college. I thought, I'd be out maybe a year or two, but that ended up turning into 9 years before I could go back full time. Over the course of those 9 years, I worked steadily to pay off NYU the money I owed in arrears, and sometimes took classes at the local community college. But I don't regret that 9-year hiatus, actually. I used that time to embark on an assiduous journey of self-exploration. It was during these years I dismantled those societal mechanisms imposed on me, which drove this internal self-loathing. This is when I turned back to the informal lessons my father, who is in this room right now, Dr. Powell, and he taught me throughout my life. Lessons that I can admit now I mostly tuned out at the time, but I did hear them. These were the stories about my history as a descendant of slaves and the African peoples from which those immediate ancestors descended. See, at the time, I felt a fierce anger. I saw that the world was unwilling to treat me fairly, and though I was no stranger to racism and its effects, I had not begun to peel back the layers of the scar tissue that I had amassed in order to survive those experiences. So I began researching the collective histories of my forebears, not just of my enslaved ancestors, but also the ones that came here in boats across the ocean. Reading everything I could about our ancestors from West Africa, such as the Edo people from Benin, or the Fulani from Mali, and many, many others. This is when I realized that my historical education to that point was sorely lacking. I had always been led to believe that the peoples of West Africa had accomplished very little to nothing. These ideas were fostered by statements such as Africans didn't invent anything, which was told to me by that same third grade teacher I mentioned earlier, or the fact that my world history textbook in high school only had one chapter, which was split between Africa and the native peoples of the American continents. So we had been effectively erased. I stress this point in my history because this is when I realized that I had the same blood of these people coursing through my own veins. And that meant I had their strength and resilience. We have survived centuries of chattel slavery, the literal enshrinement of our dehumanization in law, and continued systemic and institutionalized racism. If my ancestors survived such horror with no rights, then I should be able to devise an effective strategy to overcome most obstacles. That means all of you have their strength too. The one thing I would very much like for you all to take away from this portion of my narrative is that true understanding requires context and breadth. A STEM education without a broader education in other areas of study reduces the dimensionality of your understanding in the world and the events in the past which have shaped it. In other words, put as much effort into your other courses as you would your studies in your STEM courses. They will add color and depth to your learning and ensure that you will be a well-rounded individual. With this newly found sense of determination and earned maturity, I decided to take my transcript from CCP, which is Community College of Philadelphia, and apply to Temple University. When I started, I was super motivated. I was still working as a full-time waiter in a posh restaurant in Center City, but that didn't stop me from going all in with my coursework. In the first term, I registered for differential geometry, sociology of race and racism, classical mechanics, and abstract algebra. I was off to a good start. I was only at Temple for about a month when I had earned the respect of 2 professors, both of whom had become enormously important to my future academic success, both in very tangible and intangible ways. First, a little bit about one of them, Dr. Conrad. I took 2 courses with Dr. Conrad in that first term, differential geometry and the private survey and abstract algebra in this one-on-one seminar where we met in his office. I had aced that first examination in the geometry class, which made him take notice of me. When he handed me back my exam, he asked me to stay for a few moments after the class, where he asked me if I would be interested in participating in the Lewis-Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation, or sometimes called LSAMP. At that time, I had no idea what it was, and for those of you unfamiliar with it, it's a program funded by the National Science Foundation, committed to the goal of increasing underrepresented minority participation in STEM fields. LSAMP was instrumental in helping me get into a PhD program, as it helped me secure a spot as a research intern at Brookhaven National Laboratory after I won the Regional Science Fair sponsored by him. While I was an intern at Brookhaven Laboratory, I got a taste for what it was like to work independently in research for the first time. I had been working as an undergraduate research in the physics lab at my home institution, but I had no say over the work's progression, obviously. But in the internship, that first day, they handed me an open tube with little nipples jutting out. And they were equally spaced, and they asked me to build a thermal evaporator, which this evaporator chamber using metal object. So basically it takes this metal object it's like a deposition chamber. Actually, I have a picture that I might be able to share with you, just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. There, one moment. So that is the chamber that I built in that summer. And then I will unshare this for now. Okay, there. That's it. So they told me my project had a budget of $10,000, and my jaw dropped. I actually got a little scared because I had no idea what a thermal evaporator even was. And so I thought they were going to give me 10 grand to build something that might not work. And for a moment, I thought my career as a physicist would be over before it even started. But just to tell you, a thermal evaporator is a chamber that is used to vaporize metals by running an enormous current through a highly resistant material in which your source metal sits. So usually it's like a noble metal, which is like gold or platinum. So you literally send gold up in smoke. While the atoms are in a gaseous state, they fill the chamber, and when they absorb, which means to stick to, the surface of a cooled object, they will resolidify. These machines are ubiquitous in solid-state physics labs and chemistry labs that work with materials in which you want to run any kind of or perform an electrical measurement. So the best way to understand the purpose of doing this is to envision an electrical outlet in your wall. You plug in, say, a fan. The fan is my device. The wall outlet is the contact point to the current source, and the metal you deposit on the surface of your sample is the contact point between the devices, i.e. your sample, that you wish to measure with the machine you're using to measure it. So luckily, I had the length of the summer to get this done. I embraced my tinkerer spirit and started with a Google search. After I spent a day reading about that thermal evaporator, learning the machine's operating principles, I broke the primary components down into a list and began to price them. I needed doors for easy access, if you remember the chamber. One of the doors on the front was used to load the source material for deposition, and the other on the top of the chamber, which is where the sample was fixed, onto which you would have the vaporized metal deposited. Well, let's put it this way. The two doors together were in excess of $8,000. So, and the one to give you an idea of the size, about 10 inches was the largest door. So I thought the $10,000 budget was well under what it would cost to build this machine. Luckily, I made it a habit to get to know the people around me with whom I worked. So I enlisted the aid of staff engineers on the site, and they helped me to locate some old machines with components suitable for salvage and began cannibalizing them. I ended up having so much fun building that thing. I did it with about 2 weeks to spare. And that group at B&L still uses that chamber to this very day. I regaled you all with that story because it illustrates a very important point that I've been trying to drive home with you all. That this is how education works. Having no idea what something is, so you have to read, absorb, comprehend the concepts inherent to that project, then break those things down into actionable steps. As John Steinbeck wrote, the best laid schemes of mice and men oft go awry. So you should plan for failure, because it will always happen. Don't let that put you off your goal. You are good enough, you're smart enough to figure it out and gain a deeper understanding. When we fail, that is an opportunity for the greatest amount of understanding because we put more effort into really drilling down into the concept. Getting back to the primary point though, if you remember, I said there were two professors at Temple that were enormously important to me. The second and the more important of the two was Dr. Lin, or how I used to like to call him, my physics father. I began working in Dr. Lin's lab as an undergrad researcher in my first term again, and I went into his office regularly. By the third time I visited with him in the first 2 weeks, he took note of me. He said, you know, you come in here, but it's not like you're struggling with the material. And I said, oh yeah, I just want to kind of understand a little bit better. And he respected that. So he offered me a chance to work in his lab. And working in his lab afforded me the first look at what it was to do real physics research. And that is basically what, you know, brought me along to getting the internship at BNL. Dr. Lin had encouraged me to switch my primary major from engineering to physics, as he saw that I was talented. He trained me well, starting with the basics of safety and lab efficacy. Then he proceeded to train me on every piece of equipment in his lab. And after a while, I was measuring his samples and maintaining the equipment myself. Then after more time, reading, and learned experience, I was entrusted to synthesize the samples that were used in the experiments. The takeaway here is, don't be afraid to ask your professors if there are research opportunities available to you within your home institutions. There are also ones called REUs outside, or internships at government labs. If you want more information, please feel free to ask. I can put you in contact with people. And so I'm sure some of you are asking, you know, why am I descending into this garrulous historical argument with these people that you don't know? I mention it because this is when I discovered the power inherent to fostering relationships, or better known as networking, especially those with teachers and mentors. Most students tend to take an approach that's rather hands-off. Oops. Oh, I just got a message. Is my time up? Dr. Nelson?
You have a few minutes.
Okay.
A few minutes. So
A few minutes.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess just in summary, give me a second. I'm going to go just revisit my notes so I don't lose my place. Sorry. And there. Okay, so this is where I really want to say this. I wanted to take the time to state explicitly why I decided to share my truth, because I believe in honesty. And it's not that I want to discourage you. I live my life being honest, and I don't believe that I could be doing any of you any favors if you're wanting to pursue a STEM-based field. The best way to meet a challenge is to be prepared to face it head on. The goal should be your personal edification and growth. And much like growing your muscles in a gym, or is like growing your brain in the class, you will need to grow a battle skin. Yes, your pursuit of science in your personal is part of your personal satisfaction, but remember, you stand on the shoulders of the marginalized who came before you, just as those of people who will stand on your shoulders. We are here to show you the way to have a successful and a fortuitous future in STEM. The path isn't always easy, but it is worth it. It is very, very fulfilling. So I hope that you stick to the course. If there's any questions you have for me, I would be honored to answer any of them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. That was very, that was a call for all of us, and hopefully our students received that call also, right? That yes, we should be more aware of our sciences and work hard to them, but to develop everything else also, okay?
Yes.
And the challenges that you face, I'm pretty sure a lot of our students have faced those, and they will face them.
Yes,
Because
they
as
will.
we notice, as we go up, it's mostly sometimes you then become the only one in the room, the
Yep.
further up you go. So are there any questions for Dr. Cooper right now? Or if you do have any questions, you could put them in the chat box, and then we'll come back to them towards the end of the breakout session. Okay, okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Cooper. That was very insightful. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Van Stry. Charleston.
Okay, so now I'll be introducing Dr. Van Stry. Dr. Melanie Van Stry earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in Biochemistry from Boston College. She completed her PhD in biochemistry from Boston University School of Medicine, working with Dr. Karen Symes, studying pellet-derived growth factor signaling during gastrulation. She is currently an American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology Education Fellow and American Society for Cell Biology Minority Affairs Committee Linkage Fellow, and a member of the Genomics Education Partnership. Now we will have Dr. Van Stry.
Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about one of our projects that we do with our students. So as you just heard, I am a member of the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and we collaborate with them for undergraduate research in something called student chapters. And so our projects are where our students are actually part of the ASBMB, and they collaborate with other schools that are also part of ASBMB, and we work with the Milwaukee School of Engineering. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we this is the intersection of technology and engineering. So we're going to talk about the technology that people use to understand proteins and protein structure, and how that can be used in engineering. So proteins are the most diverse class of biomolecules found in cells, and they are really important pretty much for every function of a cell. They carry out many, many things, structural roles, catalyze reactions. And so understanding how proteins work is actually really important for understanding how life works. And there are many applications of this research for medicine or agriculture, pretty much anything where people are wanting to understand or manipulate proteins and protein function. So proteins are made up of amino acids, and the amino acid sequence determines the protein structure. The amino acid sequence is actually determined by the DNA sequence of a particular gene. So genes encode proteins. And so this amino acid sequence determines the structure. And there are actually different levels of structure. So there's primary structure, which is the amino acid sequence itself. Then there is secondary structure, which are small, what we would call features or motifs, where the protein will fold into certain little shapes, sometimes called alpha helix, others called beta sheets, others called turns. And those will fold together to form the three-dimensional structure of the protein. And that three-dimensional structure is really what determines its function. And so what our projects are focused on is really modeling those 3D structures. And so we are using data that's actually been obtained by other people in different kinds of experimental settings. So there are basically 3 kinds of methods that people use for understanding protein structure. So one is called NMR, or nuclear magnetic resonance, which is using magnets to see how the molecules are arranged. There's another method that is relatively new, and that's cryo-EM. So that's using electrons to see how the atoms are arranged. And another method that's used that's pretty old is X-ray diffraction. And so in that method, the protein is crystallized, and then it is put in a matrix where then they shine an X-ray through it. And as the X-ray hits the atoms, it will diffract. You can kind of think of this kind of diffraction if you've ever worked with a prism, where you have a white light shining through it, and then you see a rainbow on the other side. So that's another example of diffraction. So by using X-ray diffraction, we can determine where all of the different atoms are located within the crystal, and then from that deduce the structure. So I'm going to show you a couple of tools that we use. So I'm going to share my screen. And so first, we're looking at the Ncbi Database. So this is the National Center for Biotechnology Information. And this database has a lot of information that has been collected over years by many scientists and researchers. And so you can search for things in here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look for a protein. And I'm going to talk about or show you one of the proteins that our students modeled last year. So MASF-MT6. So you can just type in the name of the protein and this will pull up any information in the database about this protein. And so I'm just going to click on this one. So you can see that this is a toxin endoribonuclease and it's part of the antitoxin toxin system from Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And so by clicking on the link, this takes you to the database entry for this protein. Now it's being a little bit slow, but basically what this will give information about is how this, basically who identified the protein and who submitted it to the database, and it has the sequence as well. So I'm not sure if this is gonna load or not, but I was gonna show you, there we go. So you can see that there's the name of the protein and the organism that it's from, and this is showing the taxonomy. Here is the authors, and this was from Dr. Dunham's lab, and basically just some of the papers about it. And so if we scroll down here, then you can see here, this is the amino acid sequence. So this is the primary structure of this protein. And so this is useful if you're trying to understand how this protein might be related to other proteins. And so we can use some other tools in the database, for example, running a blast to find related proteins or conserved domains, which would be looking for parts of the protein that might be similar. But what we're going to talk about today is the structure. So there's another database that you can use. And this is where we can actually find the three-dimensional structure of this protein. And so what I'm going to put in here is the protein data bank reference for this protein. And this pulls up the structure. And here, this is showing in a kind of a schematic view, the overall 3D structure of the protein. And so this is just a static picture, but we know that proteins are three-dimensional. And so you can use the 3D view here, or you can use other tools that you want to make this, to look at the 3D structure. And so what our students actually did was they downloaded this file that's used to make this image into another program called JMOL. And there, then they can manipulate the structure. And then from JMOL, we can actually export it as another kind of file that can then be used on a 3D printer. And so that is where we interfaced with engineering. So the 3D printing was actually done at Milwaukee School of Engineering in their Center for Biomolecular Modeling. So I'm going to show you the JMOL. And so right now you probably just see a black, and you guys see it, it's just a black screen for JMOL, but we can actually program this to load the 3D structure of our protein. And so it looks it's kind of hard to see here what the structure is, because this is showing all of the atoms. And so you can actually then do some computer scripting to have it show you specifically what you want. So I'm going to put in some more code. And this code was actually written by our students at Lane College. And so here is what we basically have done now is turned off a lot of the atoms, and they are wanting to show the secondary structures. And so in this particular one, we have labeled the alpha helix in gray, and then the beta sheets are in purple, and then the hydrogen bonds that are holding together the beta sheets are in pink. And this particular protein is a dimer, and so you can see right here is the dimer interface. But you can also look at some other features of the protein. So I'm going to just stick some more things in here. And so the students were using information from that paper that I just showed you in the database by Dr. Dunham's lab to highlight certain features of this protein. And so we can look at specific amino acids, and here we can look at the amino acids that are important in catalysis. And so this is a ribonuclease. This enzyme actually will cut one of the RNAs in the ribosome. So the ribosome is the molecular machine in the cell that builds proteins. And so what this molecule actually does is shut down translation or building proteins within the mycobacterium. And it's part of its survival mechanism. So if it's under stress, it's going to kind of go in a dormant state. And to do that, it needs to stop protein synthesis. And so this enzyme will cut the ribosome and inactivate it. And so what the students wanted to do was model the active site. And this was based on work that was done by Dr. Dunham's lab. And they had done some mutations in different places in the protein, trying to elucidate the active site. And so in this particular model, they're showing, the students wanted to show the mutations that were made by that group. And there were some amino acids that were mutated. So one was threonine, here, this threonine, and also a lysine, and then this threonine, this is an arginine, and this aspartic acid. And so in order for this enzyme to work, it needs called a catalytic triad. And so that would basically mean that you have an acid group next to a base, which is going to be next to something that has a hydroxyl that then can be activated to make what we would call a nucleophilic attack on the ribosome RNA. And so Dr. Dunham's group did not know which of these amino acids were actually part of the catalytic triad. And so they mutated several of them and looked at enzymatic function. And so they determined that it was actually this aspartic acid, this arginine, and this threonine that were important in catalysis. And these other residues here were not part of the catalytic triad. So you also notice that for this dimer, that the active site is, there's two active sites and they're very close together. Okay, so from the 3D model here that we made in JMOL, you can actually export this into another file that then can be used to build a 3D model. And so this is the 3D model that our students built of that enzyme and using that JMOL file that I just showed you. And so we actually decided just to do one of the subunits instead of the dimer because they really wanted to highlight the active site, which is right here. And so you can see, I can stick my finger in here. So that's where the RNA from the ribosome would fit right in there in the active site. And so this 3D model was made out of, it's made out of plaster and it has a plastic coating on it. And so it was made at Milwaukee School of Engineering. They actually have several different 3D printers, and depending on what kind of model you want to make, then you choose the right kind of printer for it. And this one, this is a very sturdy model, and it's handy because you can actually see in quite detail the different structures here. So here's an alpha helix, and then here is the beta barrel right here in the middle, and then we can see the active site, and the amino acid side chains. So you can decide which side chains you want to show, or if you don't want to show any side chains. So it's a really nice way to help students to understand protein structure, and then also have a tactile model where they can actually look at it. So a lot of people may have difficulty in visualizing something from a two-dimensional picture to a 3D. So this is a really handy way for students to be able to understand protein structure and function. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Dr. Van Stry. That was very enlightening. And you mentioned something about X-ray diffraction. And I did some work with X-ray diffraction in my graduate work. So I was wondering, were those structures based off powder X-ray diffraction or single crystal X-ray diffraction?
Those were based off of single crystal X-ray diffraction.
Okay.
So yeah, so the protein crystallization is actually really tricky. And I did some of that work when I was an undergraduate at Boston College. My mentor was a X-ray crystallographer, and she was in the chemistry department. And so we, to crystallize the proteins, you have to have a certain concentration to get to the right concentration where it's going to form a crystal and not become amorphous goo. Mm-hmm. And so we use the hanging drop method. There's another method called the sitting drop method. But basically, you have your protein dissolved in a solution, and then you have another in the well, you have another solution, and you actually have diffusion of the water out of your protein solution into the higher concentration solution in the well to try to get to the optimized crystal. And so to crystallize the protein, like I said, is very tricky. And so that's why this cryo-EM technology is really taking off, because you don't need a crystal in order to get the structure. And so there's a whole bunch of cryo-EM structures coming out, especially right now on the many proteins from SARS-CoV-2. So people are trying to understand the function of those proteins. And so rather than trying to crystallize, which can take a long time because you have to clone it and then you have to express it, purify it, and get the right conditions for the crystal, they can go straight to looking at the structure in the virus. So yeah. Okay.
Thank you. My work
You're
was
welcome.
that stringent. I did
Okay.
thermal synthesis to get my crystals. It was daunting, but you know, we could change our concentrations and get different structures. So that's what we were playing with, just the changing concentrations. But there's another thing that you mentioned, and I want students to always pay attention to this. You mentioned something about structure and the properties. And I've told students a lot in my especially higher level chemistry class that structure determines properties. And because of what we're seeing now, and you're showing us with the XRD and those images, when you could see the structure directly, especially with the 3D images, you could understand better the properties that they will change and how they change and how they affect that. So I really enjoyed and liked that part of it. There are any other questions for Dr. Van Stry?
Actually, I had a question. So I was just curious. Do you utilize any other spectrographic methodologies to characterize the sample? Like, I remember when I was at VNL, I was at the National Synchrotron Light Source. And oftentimes you would see people using, basically, I guess they were cryogenically frozen, the proteins, because this is not my area of expertise. And I was kind of interested, because I said, well, how do you get diffraction? This isn't a crystal, right? But then I realized, well, of course, in this way it is. But do you use any other kind of spectroscopy or spectrographic techniques to characterize?
Yeah, so there are lots of different techniques that biochemists use. So one is called circular dichroism, but that one doesn't work very well to give you a 3D structure. That one gives you a good sense of what kinds of secondary structure would be present. So the main three techniques that are used to get the full 3D structure are X-ray diffraction, cryo-EM, and NMR. But NMR only works with really small proteins. So with those large proteins, it doesn't work as well. And so each of the methods has their limitations. The cryo-EM doesn't always give you the highest resolution. But like I said, crystallization is very difficult to do, and especially when you're looking at a membrane protein, because it would not be in an aqueous environment. So cryo-EM is more useful for those kinds of proteins.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Van Stry. Now we're gonna go ahead with our last presentation, and that will be our live or lived experience by Dr. Brandon Pitts. And Ms. Lee, our moderator, will go ahead and introduce them.
All right. So now we are going to have Dr. Brandon Pitts. He is an assistant professor in the School of Industrial Engineering. He is the director of the Next Generation Human Systems and Cognitive Engineering Lab and faculty associate with the Center on Aging and Life course at Purdue University. Dr. Pitts received a BS in Industrial Engineering from Louisiana State University and an MSc and PhD in Industrial and Operations Engineering from the University of Michigan. Now we will have Dr. Brandon Pitts.
Thank you, and I'm going to try to just share my screen here. It's asking me what I want to share. I'm going to try to do this one, and please let me know what you guys are seeing. Are you seeing a presentation mode, or are you seeing a PowerPoint?
It's in presentation mode.
Okay, great. So yes, so I'm Dr. Brandon Pitts, and I'm excited today to talk to you guys about just, I guess, my career path. And the title of this talk is "The Sky is Not the Limit." And it may seem a little corny, but there's a reason why I did that. And I hope this very quickly I can get to the point and help you understand why I'm saying that. And so just a little bit about myself. And I just want to make sure, Dr. Nelson, you guys do see slide 2 now?
No, it's still on
Okay.
the first one.
Okay, give me just a second here. Sorry about this. Okay, how about now?
So it's in presentation mode, but it's still on the first slide.
Okay,
Yes.
okay,
You're to the
great. So let's do this. There we go. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and during the transition session with Mr. Nathaniel Clark, I realized we have overlapping experiences. He said that he was from Monroe, Louisiana, which is northern Louisiana, and I'm from Baton Rouge, which is actually southern Louisiana, about 70 miles north of the Gulf of Mexico. So it gives you an idea of that I'm a hurricane guy, so I know all about that. So I did my undergraduate at Louisiana State, also a commonality I had with Mr. Clark, but I had a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering, and then I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where I actually met Dr. Nelson. So thank you so much for inviting me. That's where I did a master's and a PhD in industrial and operations engineering. I did a short postdoc at the Center for Healthcare Engineering and Patient Safety. And then now I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University here in West Lafayette, Indiana. I've been here for 4 years now. So if you knew me as a kid, then the only things that I would talk to my family and friends about was aviation. Okay, I was the kid that loved to go to airports and could literally sit there and watch airplanes take off and land all day long and never get tired of it. And I can tell you where I'm at today, I still am not tired of seeing that sight. It's something that fascinates me, and I'm not sure I can explain why, and I've become comfortable with that because people have told me that generally people know what they like and what they don't like, even if they can't express why they don't or why they like it or don't. And so I'm content with that. But what I'm not proud to say is that it wasn't until I was in my early adult years where I actually saw a Black pilot. Okay, and so you can think about what that could have been like for me as a kid, wanting to be this pilot and never seeing myself represented in this occupation. So I actually went to a pretty good high school in Baton Rouge, and my goal was to be a pilot. So I had a deep interest in math and science. I did well in those classes, and my intention was to ultimately become a pilot. Unfortunately, Louisiana did not have, so when it got time for me to graduate, there were two schools that I was interested in. One of them is in Northern Louisiana, that's Louisiana Tech University, which did have a professional aviation program. But the issue was that flight lessons there were very, very, very expensive. My parents were not were not set up to be able to fund that. And we're talking about possibly $20,000 in flight cost on top of tuition. So my parents were not set up to handle that. And at 18, 19 years old, I was not comfortable taking out loans for that, even though this was my dream. So at the time, I thought I was settling because I ended up going to Louisiana State University, and I actually majored in chemical engineering, wouldn't you know it, right? All of this interest I had in aviation, but I ended up taking on chemical engineering because I did well in chemistry. I liked chemistry. I did well in math. I liked math. And I said, well, you know what? I think I'll settle, okay? My first semester in college, I had a 7:30 chemistry class that did not go well. And the more I learned about chemical engineering, people told me that I actually was going to be studying in my upper level classes, studying how chemicals are processed and understanding how they flow through pipes and pressures and things that just didn't seem intriguing to me. So I talked to a career counselor, and the only major that I felt at the time was close enough to, that would get me to aviation was actually industrial engineering, because it was a process improvement engineering. And so you can see some of the images I have here representing what some people in the aviation industry who have industrial engineering backgrounds might actually be doing. So project management, working at Boeing, for example, understanding how planes are assembled, right? Or working in an airline where you're trying to manage the operations of how planes enter and exit. How do you schedule flights? How do you schedule crews? How do you make sure that air traffic controllers are equipped with the tools that they need to make sure that they can manage the airspace? While I was in college, I had the chance to do, and I think Dr. Cooper talked about this, an undergraduate research experience. This took me out of the South, which was a good thing for me at the time, but we considered Iowa to be North, not Midwest. But now I've spent enough time in the Midwest to know now that actually Iowa is Midwestern, not North. So I did a summer research experience program there. And the plan was that I was supposed to be working in a research lab called the Operators Performance Lab, which was a professor who was doing work with human factors in aviation. And so you can see these are real pictures that I took. This is me visiting the lab, and he was trying to understand the displays, the controls, the informations, those kinds of things that pilots need to actually successfully fly airplanes. And so I was pretty excited about it because I felt like my dream of being one step closer to becoming a pilot was actually being fulfilled. However, in 2008, I don't know how many people remember this, but the Iowa City River had other plans for me. And the airport that we were working at actually was located close to the Iowa City River. And that year we had unprecedented flooding of the Mississippi River, if anyone remembers. And so that actually did not give me the chance to work at the airport. So I actually had to change what I was doing. And there was a professor on campus, his name is Dr. John D. Lee, who was gracious enough to bring me into his lab where I was not able to do aviation research, but I could do driving research. And this was actually a great experience for me. You can see some of the pictures that I took that year. Again, me in the car. The University of Iowa actually has this, what they call a National Advanced Driving Simulator, which is a dome-like structure where they can actually simulate real world driving, and they can bring people in and test out a variety of different things, right? This is an apparatus that moves. It's got 6 degrees of freedom, and you can simulate vibration, noise, just about every experience that you can have on the real road is what they were able to capture here. And so this was very fascinating. Now, at the time, Iowa had the largest driving simulator in the world. I think just a few years after I left Iowa, Toyota ended up building one that was a little bit larger. Okay, but this was this was a great experience. And this professor, John Lee, is actually someone who's well known internationally about in the area of driver distraction, in-vehicle technologies, and the like. So anything you can think of, any aspects of the vehicle that you can think about the human interacting with, this guy, I promise you, has done research in the area. So the following year, I finally did get the chance to get back into the aviation industry because of what happened in 2008. And I got to work in Continental Airlines, which is now United Airlines. And you can see me standing here on side of Boeing 777. And I didn't think this picture was meaningful at the time, but this is actually the largest aircraft that Boeing was developing at the time. And you can see just one engine, how much larger it is than I am. But working for Continental that year was actually one of the best summers of my life. We got flight benefits, and I really got to understand just how complex aviation is, right? You often, when it's time for you to go on a trip, you usually go to the airport, you check in, you sit down, wait for your plane, you wait for the time for them to call you, let you know it's time to board, scan your ticket, get on the plane, sit down, and you really don't think about all the other millions of things that are happening around you. And this summer, I got to see it. And I'm telling you, this has been over 10 years ago, and I'm still pretty fascinated about it. What was difficult for me, though, is this was coming close to the time for me to graduate undergrad, and I had a variety of experiences. Okay, first of all, I felt too young to actually go into industry. I felt too young to start working, but I had loved my research experience that I had with Dr. Lee doing human factors in driving. I loved my aviation internship with Continental Airlines, and so I really had to think about what was next for me. Okay. I had applied at the time to about 4 different industry jobs that I didn't get, but I also at the same time applied to about 6 graduate schools that I had the chance to be accepted to. And it actually turned out for me that I went to the University of Michigan because the professor that I wanted to work with there was an expert in human factors in aviation. So this allowed me to fill that gap that I wasn't able to do in 2008. And something even more extraordinary happened. Her lab, Dr. Nadine Sarter, was actually working in both aviation and driving. So I had 6 years in a PhD program where I was able to do both of the things that I really, really liked. Now I am a professor at Purdue where I have my own lab. It's called the Enhanced Lab. I've got a group of students where we're doing a lot of the same things in aviation and driving. You can see this is one of the tools that we have in our research lab. And in fact, it's a National Advanced Driving Simulator, similar to what I saw in Iowa. It's not the $1 million one that they have. It's a version that they've created. So this is great. Just kind of wrapping things up. In our lab, we are really investigating a wide range of different technologies and tools, what we call next generation technologies, speech recognition systems, augmented and virtual reality displays, adaptive interfaces, autonomous driving systems. Those are the things we're interested in because anybody, in my mind, any engineer who's designing anything for humans need to have some kind of understanding of how humans think about and interact with a variety of tools and technologies. And this is some of the fun that we get to do. We work in a wide variety of different environments. So aviation, I mentioned, autonomous driving. We think about what automation and robots look like on assembly lines. We think about surgeons who are using robotic technologies to help robotic and assistive robot surgeries. We're thinking about even Tesla, who's trying to be able to make space travel accessible for a wide range of people. we're thinking about what those information displays and technologies need to look like. If you're interested in the field, these are some of the places that that hire industrial engineers and that are very interested in this human factors and HCI and UI UX design, and are looking to hire these experts. And then these are just some final closing tips that I have for the students who are on the call. Make sure that you ask lots of questions. That shows that you're interested in things. And it also helps you get a better understanding about things that you want to do. Make sure that you talk to people. I didn't say text, I didn't say email, I'm saying actually talk. Okay, I think that's a skill that I see is starting to dwindle, and I want to encourage people that we are human beings, and human to human interaction can never be replaced by technology. Be open to ideas that you hadn't thought about. I was always thinking about pilot. I never thought about doing research and driving, but because I was open to the idea, now I'm able to do both of those. And instead of me being one pilot, I'm able to design and evaluate technologies that'll be used on every aircraft in the world, instead of me flying just one simple plane. That to me is impactful, and that's one of the reasons that I'm excited about getting up every day. That is why I said that the sky is not the limit, because I thought aviation was the limit for me, where the man up above was telling me that there was something much greater that was in store for me. So thank you so much. I know I went over a little bit, but here's my contact information. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, I do have a Twitter profile, and we've got faculty profiles as well as our lab website. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pitts. That was very insightful. I really enjoyed it. And yes, Dr. Pitts and I met at the University of Michigan while I was doing my postdoc and he was in graduate school. So thank you so much for that. I have one question. Do you have any internship opportunities for like some of our students that's participating in this conference? That will be great.
Yes, so last year we got a big award from the NSF that deals with cyber physical systems, where we're trying to understand how well, to what extent can technology actually help with training. So if you're trying to teach someone to learn how to use complex technologies, how can we program technologies that can actually walk a person through the steps? So for example, can a cockpit actually teach you how to fly an airplane? Because of the virus, we weren't able to do that this year, but if anybody is interested, we do have a program called SIRI as a part of that project, SIRI, for which we are certainly looking for students to be a part of the project, and they can be here at Purdue or at the University of New Mexico, where the host or the PI of that project is actually housed. So,
Thank you, Dr. Pitts. Actually, we have about 2 minutes to wrap up. Thank everyone for a very insightful and engaging session. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Cooper and Dr. Van Stry and Dr. Pitts. Are there any more questions, comments at this time? Before we have to leave, we have approximately 2 minutes. Well, 1 minute at this point.
I thought that the session was really really exciting. I thought that the opportunity to relate faculty to faculty and a kind of faculty development kind of approach was really exciting, Dr. Weinstein. And I thought that the students can benefit. Again, the sky is not the limit. Anything that you want is possible. And I thank all of the presenters for their presentation. And I'll pass it on to Dr. Hance for a 30-second or a minute closing. Dr. Hance, you're on mute. There you are.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say this is such an exciting conference that it was trailblazing. And I wish that more students could actually participate, because I think we would raise the bar and have more students involved in engineering. I've never participated in a conference that provided such detail and such analysis and such candidness, because I think what a lot of people think about when they think about engineering or becoming an engineer, I think internally they say, well, I'm not really good at math and science, so, you know, I'm just not fit for this particular career path. And we've seen in the last 2 days how people have told their hearts and soul stories about, well, I wasn't that good, and I had this opportunity, and this person encouraged me. And I think that this is very encouraging. So not only do we have a trailblazing conference, we have measurable outcomes. And I'm so proud to be part of this and happy that the U.S. Department of Education could play a small part in facilitating this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You get the last word, Dr. Nelson from Payne.
Well, I was just saying thank you to everyone and thank you for a very great session. We're about to now go back to the main room because our breakout session is about to end, but thank you for this engaging session and I will see you guys in the main conference room.